This podcast is brought to you by HEC Paris.
Thank you, Watson, and thank you, Bernard. And thanks to all of you for being here today. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be here today, particularly to be just a small part of your extended 125th anniversary. What you didn't tell me when you invited me was that I was following Bill Gates. That's a very tough act to follow. Bill Gates, as you know, spent 1 year at Harvard and then left to found a company. I made the mistake of staying longer, and I'm still there. I'm sorry to say. Still waiting for my ship to come in, as it were. But it's a thrill for me to be here. Your school and the Harvard Business School have had a relationship over the years. We have seen cooperation and collaboration among people from each of our faculties. We're working together now on a number of case studies and some important research. We appreciate that collaboration and we would like to do more. So I'm pleased to be here and to talk some with you today. I'd like to focus my remarks on the evolution and, more importantly, the future of management education in general, and in particular on the future and evolution of the degree we call the MBA. This is a topic that is receiving widespread attention over the last few years, particularly in the US. And it has become a focus of debate among academics at business schools, also among university presidents, to whom we report, also in the media and among practitioners. To put the issue bluntly, I would just quote to you the title of several articles in the press in recent months. The title of those articles is something like, "Is the MBA degree still relevant?" So I'll give you my answer to that, but don't leave yet. There's still time. I will give you my answer to that. But in order to get there, I want to talk some about how we've gotten to where we are now and what I think the issues are. So to understand where we are, it's helpful to go all the way back to the beginning and figure out where we came from. And if you'll forgive me, I'll focus most of my attention on the evolution of the MBA degree in the US, perhaps appropriately so, because that's in fact where it evolved. But indeed, in later years, what has been going on in Europe, to some extent, is similar. So management education broadly had its roots in the 19th century when schools of commerce began, basically vocational schools that arose in the US in the 1840s, the 1850s, and the 1860s. And they taught primarily skills. The three things they really taught were bookkeeping, inventory control, and selling. And that was pretty much it. These began to be supplanted and supplemented in the latter part of the 19th century by university-based schools of business. In the US, the first collegiate business school was the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. It was founded in 1881. That was a good vintage, as you know. It was founded in 1881, founded as a 3-year, what we would call undergraduate curriculum. The notion of a graduate degree in business did not yet exist. And it did exist for some period of time merely as a 3-year undergraduate degree as part of the liberal arts curriculum. All other degrees, by the way, were 4 years, giving you some sense of the intellectual regard with which even the Wharton faculty held that degree at the time. My own institution, the Harvard Business School, was founded, as your dean just explained, in 1908. So we're about ready to celebrate our 100th birthday. We think of that as old, but only by comparison with folks other than you. We were the first school. We were founded as a school explicitly not to have any what we would call undergraduate or bachelor's degrees. The criteria when we were founded was that you had to have 4 years of college already and a bachelor's degree before you were eligible to come. And we were the first school to do that, and thus the first graduate school of business education in the U.S. Simultaneously, we invented the title Masters in Business Administration, or MBA, and we were the first grantors of that degree. It was a 2-year program, and we haven't changed our mind about that yet. We still think it's a 2-year program, and that's all we do. Relatively soon, several other business schools started within the U.S. They too were 2-year programs. They adopted the label MBA, and the MBA industry, if you will, was off and running in the United States. It's important, though, to reflect on what the founders of these schools thought they were doing and what the special purpose of these schools was. And so I wanted to talk about that for a while and perhaps quote from our founding dean. To put it all in historical perspective, the early decades of the 20th century, when these schools were created, were tumultuous. There had been quite a boom and quite a bust. Business enterprises of unprecedented size and scope had emerged, industries such as the railroads, oil companies, chemical companies, and others. These companies created a need for new and far more sophisticated management skills than had been required in the past. Moreover, they brought tremendous changes to American society, and for the first time placed great power and influence in the hands of professional managers who were not the owners of the business. Up until then, it had been the owners of businesses who in fact held the power and the influence and were accountable for what went on within those organizations, both to their employees and to the society at large. And for the first time, the professional managers who weren't owners, but who still managed these companies, rose to prominent position. What happened in the tumultuous times of the first decade of the 20th century was there were a number of very important scandals, and some of the professional managers were found to be at the heart of those scandals. And that led to a profound disillusionment with the role of professional manager as distinct from owner. And it was in that context that the MBA program was invented, and the MBA program was seen as the solution to that set of issues. So the early business school founders and the early business school deans in the U.S. Sought to create MBA programs that did at least 2 things. First of all, they imparted a new kind of managerial skills for the new top managers of firms, rather than just bookkeeping and selling and more entry-level kind of skills. But second of all, and perhaps more importantly, they also hope to cultivate attitudes and values, in short, to develop character and integrity. They set out to equip their graduates with tools for business success, as well as an appreciation of the role business played in the larger society, and along with that, a clear sense of purpose and responsibility. Edwin Gay, our first dean, our founding dean, was representative of his time. He viewed the school's goal as developing among its students, and here I'm going to quote from the description that he gave of the school. It was to develop among its students, quote, a habit of intellectual respect for business as a profession, with the social implications and heightened sense of responsibility that goes with that. To do this, he believed, would require a full 2 years beyond the normal years of a college degree. So that's where we all got started. Thus, early business schools sought, through the use of teaching of skills and values, to develop what came to be known as general managers, and they became known as schools of general management. And with this focus, the very first axis that would come to define management education writ large was set, namely that of managerial relevance, with a focus on practice, teaching skills for top management, and teaching values for top management. Further reinforcing this emphasis was the fact that many of the individuals that were recruited to teach at these schools were themselves practitioners, not academics, but practitioners, often drawn from the key industries such as railroads, oils, and chemicals that were dominating business at the time. They brought experience, they brought insight, and they brought values and integrity from their businesses into the classroom and taught about all of those things. Over the next few decades, growth in the field continued. More U.S. schools were founded. Stanford, for example, was founded in 1925, and the older ones developed full-fledged curricula and stronger faculties. Even so, by the end of World War II, there were still relatively few schools offering management education, and those that did tended to maintain the focus on general management that had characterized them from the start. By about the year 1950, business schools within the U.S. and abroad were a very homogeneous lot. They were all 2 years. They were all schools of general management. One could move from school to school and recognize exactly what the curriculum was, exactly what the faculty was trying to do, and exactly what the objectives of the institution were. In the post-war era, though, all of this began to change significantly. A number of forces were at play. First, during World War II, new concepts such as statistics, applied mathematics, and economics proved tremendously effective in dealing with the problems of managing large-scale enterprises, most importantly, by the way, the war itself. The war itself was the great triumph of what later became known as operations research. Analytical techniques and methods such as linear programming proved very effective in the context of the war and appeared to have significant application to business organizations and operations. And business schools began experimenting with their curriculums to see how these new concepts might be incorporated into them. Second, there was a tremendous post-war economic boom, unlike the worldwide depression that preceded the war. And that boom was causing explosive growth in American businesses and in businesses in Europe, and increasing greatly the demand for executive talent everywhere. And finally, thirdly, and most importantly, there was a growing concern that business schools themselves were doing very little to tie business training, as it was then known, to any scientific method or material. Critics of the time saw curricula as focusing too much on vocationalism and the basic techniques and tools necessary for entry-level jobs. Academic standards had been developed and brought to bear in other fields within the university, for example, law and medicine during the 1920s and 30s, but not in business schools. And critics felt that business schools in the 1950s were in fact lagging in at least three key areas. First, academic rigor. While these schools were a part of universities, they paid little attention to the developing scientific theories of management. Second, research. Few business schools had a research emphasis, in large part because of the practitioner background of most instructors that I talked about earlier. Indeed, in the early 1950s, fewer than half the full-time faculty at any leading business school held doctorates, and fewer still did any research. It was indeed a different time. And finally, doctoral programs. Doctoral education was viewed as inadequate. They were small. They were relatively low quality. Often students entering and emerging from those programs, the best of them went on and chose higher paying jobs in practice rather than academia. And doctoral programs were not serving as the important conduit to feed the faculties of growing business schools. With all this as a context, during the 1950s and early 1960s, the Carnegie and Ford Foundations in the U.S. released reports that strongly criticized U.S. business schools for their lack of academic rigor and advocated a much more scientific approach to the study of management. Reform was crucial, they thought, not just to address the problems they identified, but looking forward, they anticipated very large numbers of students, the baby boom generation as it came to be known following the war, entering both college and later graduate school. And it was feared that this influx would place even greater demands on business programs ill-equipped to train a new generation of scientific managers. Beginning in the 1960s, and with extremely generous support from the Ford Foundation and some other foundations, the pendulum began to shift, slowly at first, and then relatively quickly. This was the same period, by the way, in which business schools began to develop in larger numbers in Europe itself, where a similar process was at work. Business schools raised the standards for admissions to their graduate programs. They hired and developed faculty who increasingly were discipline-based. They strengthened their doctoral programs, which also became much more discipline-based. New frameworks and models were brought to bear on management issues, theories developed to explain management changes. A number of fields in particular developed in an increasingly different way, including finance, operations management and research, and marketing. And these fields were greatly enhanced by the introduction of more rigorous and scientific methods of research. I was indeed part, as you might have guessed from my Ford Foundation background, of that movement in the 60s. Another result was that more and more business schools began to develop academically oriented programs organized around disciplinary specialization, particularly the behavioral sciences and quantitative techniques, as opposed to the functional specialization of earlier decades. With this focus, the new axis and second axis that would come to define management education had been set, namely academic rigor as well as managerial relevance. Over the next few decades, management education continued to grow, both in the U.S. and abroad. In the U.S., for example, the number of MBA degrees conferred rose from something like 3,000 at the end of the 1950s to well over 100,000 a year today. That is one of the great growth industries of our time. And of course, the growth has indeed been global, and globally is well above 100,000 a year. Executive education, which had also been introduced in the 1950s, largely by the Harvard Business School, also came by the end of the century to represent a very large and growing component of many business schools' activities. More MBA programs, such as the one here, emerged and flourished abroad, as did many variations on the degree itself. But the development of academic rigor, the second axis, did not take the same form in all MBA programs. Earlier, recall, virtually all MBA programs looked the same. As a faculty member, you could move from one school to the next and barely miss a beat. Now all that began to change. Faculty, for example, became quite different from one school to another. Some schools more disciplinary based, some schools more functionally based, some schools more managerially based. The character of research being pursued by those faculty also began to change and to become quite different across schools. The nature of the learning process, be it case method or lecture or other kinds of participative processes, began to change too and began to be quite different across schools. The type of students that different schools sought began to change. And so it was on many dimensions they began to be quite different from each other. Some more specialized, some more general management oriented, some more global, some more domestic, etc. And indeed, the MBA industry within the US, and for sure abroad, became what I would call a highly fragmented industry with different schools pursuing their own very different objectives. The popular press likes to refer to the MBA program as if it were one relatively homogeneous group of schools. In fact, those of us who work in these schools know nothing could be further from the truth. It has, in fact, become a very interesting, very differentiated, very fragmented kind of educational operation. A second thing has started to happen too and has aided that and abetted that fragmentation. A number of variations on the degree began and continue to this day. For example, executive MBA versus MBA. I'm still not sure I know what that means, although I think I know them when I see them. One-year programs versus two-year programs. And there's some year-and-a-half programs and some 15-month programs and some 27-month programs. Undergraduate programs within the U.S. have begun to teach large parts of what used to be taught just within the MBA. A whole series of executive education offerings to the younger ranks of management have developed, which begin to look like an MBA or maybe an EMBA. It's hard to say. Some of them are on weekends, some of them are on weekdays, some of them are in the evenings, some are in the mornings. Internal company training programs have begun. Most large U.S. companies now have an internal campus and hire faculty, typically from business schools, to deliver things that look suspiciously like MBA courses to their employees and only their employees. And by the way, sometimes they hire our faculty on an hourly basis to deliver those kinds of programs. There's a whole industry called the custom executive education industry, which is the fastest growing part of management education, where individual companies hire business schools to deliver particular programs to senior executives. Online MBA education has become a big business. Sorry to tell you, but you can go online and you can buy an MBA in a box. That's the title that's the label they put on it. I can't imagine what an MBA in a box is, but you can buy it, and it's pretty cheap. The publishing industry has begun to get on the bandwagon and has a whole variety of MBA-like things, at least things they put the MBA label on. In short, what's going on is the fragmentation and commoditization of management education through a wide variety of different kinds of heterogeneous channels to widely different groups of potential students, and it's happening everywhere. It's the result of not only tremendous growth and demand for management education, but different people trying to figure out different and more effective means of delivering it. Well, all the while this has been going on, the world has been changing. You know at least as much about this as I do. I'll just tick off some important things. The world of business is globalizing, and global competition has become the name of the game. That's a lot more complex than where we used to be. Indeed, even within a geography, competing across industry boundaries through technology, through advanced telecommunications, has in fact become the name of the game. Again, making things much more complicated than they were even just 10 years ago. Interfunctional complexity, where it isn't quite clear where marketing and selling and manufacturing and product design and all of those interface, has become the norm within most modern companies. Leaner, more networked organizational forms within the firm and across firms and among affiliated groups of firms have become the norm. Again, making how one gets things done quite a bit more complicated. And finally, all this is being driven by a pace of change that appears, at least to my eye, to be accelerating, and which makes it all even all the more interesting and complex and difficult to figure out. All of this change has led to management being in a situation where it's perfectly clear that management skills are much more important now than ever. Management and business judgment is much more important now than ever. The ability to quickly size up a complex decision and make a complex situation and make a decision and get an organization to pursue that decision has become ever more important. The leadership necessary to carry that all out has become ever more important. One would have thought that it was clear that the MBA degree was the degree to have. And yet, at least in the United States, it is subject to widespread criticism right now. So the question is, why? What is there going on that's leading to that, and how should we think about all that? Well, I think there are actually three things going on, which are quite different from each other, and all three of which I think need to be talked about. The first, and maybe the simplest of them, is that in the first decade of this century, rather like the first decade of the last century, there have been a number of corporate scandals, most of them in the US, though we don't have a monopoly on that. And in those corporate scandals, it turns out that people who have earned MBAs have played a prominent role. And you might say to yourself, wait a minute, what happened? That was one of the things, in fact, that was the thing the MBA was supposed to do and do well, if you remember where it all came from. And yet, did it? So that's part of where the concern is. A second part of the concern is as schools have pursued more and more an agenda of academic rigor, they've sometimes forgotten about managerial relevance. It's easy to pursue academic rigor. It's easy to pursue it, particularly in a more discipline-based way, and sometimes lose sight of the fact that one needs to be developing ideas, one needs to be developing publications that have real power and practice. that really mean something to the ongoing task of management. And all too often, I think, some schools and some academics, and we are as guilty of it as anybody, have diverged some from the criteria of managerial relevance in search of rigor itself. And that, I think, has been a mistake. And finally, to the extent quite a few of the tools and theories and models are in fact managerially relevant, they have in fact become more commoditized. It's easier to get them at your first employer. It's easier to get them in a magazine. It's easier to get them online. It's easier to get them in lots of places. And the commoditization of the simple frameworks, along with the search for managerial relevance among some of the more sophisticated frameworks, has led to an interesting competition from both sides on the spectrum of ideas. And one must admit, all three of these criticisms are at least in part valid. And all three, I think, are things that we have to address. And so one raises the question, is the MBA degree still relevant? So I'll give you my answer to that. You can probably guess what it is, but I'll give you two answers. The first one you might not guess. If the goal is to learn some relatively simple tools and theories and frameworks that apply in your first several years of a business career, is the MBA still relevant? I would answer, probably not. Probably not. You can probably learn that stuff in other places. That's probably near, you probably don't have to take 2 years of your life out to get that stuff. So I would say probably not. I can find you cheaper and simpler places to get that. But if instead the goal is a somewhat more complex goal, if the goal is to really develop business judgment, if it's to develop the ability to analyze really complex, fast-changing competitive situations, to figure out what's really going on there, to figure out what the right questions are. You know, anybody can figure out the right answers are if you know what the right questions are, but to figure out what the right questions are, to set priorities, to figure out how to analyze, to figure out how to make decisions, if that's your goal. If your goal is business leadership, once you've done that, once you've made the decision, if the goal is how do you take a decision and turn it into an agenda for change, how do you communicate to an organization and lead an organization down that agenda for change? How do you develop the kind of values and attitudes and integrity that allow you to do that in the context of a larger organization? If those kinds of things are your goal, then in fact the MBA not only is relevant, but I think is more relevant than it has ever been before. Not just any old thing that a marketing agent might slap on the label MBA on, and for sure not an MBA in a box. That's not going to do it. It's going to take faculty who know about and care about business and practice. It's going to take intense engagement between those faculty and students. It's going to take engagement over a prolonged period of time. Online won't do it. 2 days won't do it. It's going to take a long time of engagement looking at really complicated situations and trying to figure out what the right questions are and how you think about agendas for change. Cases and the case method are one way to do it. It wouldn't surprise you. I'm an advocate of them, but for sure they're not the only way to do it. But the way to do it has to be engaging and it has to be participative, and you've got to get your whole mind into it. Otherwise, it's not going to do the very special thing that university MBA-based education can do. It's, at the end of the day, in my judgment, more about the process than it is about anything else. How you learn is at least as important as what you learn, and that's true every day. You come to a place like this. Now, we should have known this all along. At the Harvard Business School, we are paranoid about the future, and we spend a lot of time surveying our alumni. We now have about 68,000 of them that have been through our program, and we survey them all the time. If you survey them when they're, let's say, 1, 2, or 3 years out and say, what was it that was valuable that you learned while you were here? They talk about tools, and they talk about techniques, and they talk about functional specialization, and they talk about theories, and they talk about that kind of stuff. And they're very clear that's where the value came from. And if you talk to them 15 and 20 and 25 years out and you ask them the same question, the very same kinds of people, they actually don't mention any of that stuff. All they talk about is what the learning experience was about. They talk about the process of how they learned. They talk about learning from experienced faculty. They talk about how they learned to figure out what the right question was. They talk about how they learned to think about what was important and what wasn't important. They talk about how they learned to learn, and they developed a framework of thinking that allowed them to renew themselves every year as the world changed and as different things became important and as the organizations of which they were part became necessary to learn how to do new things. They talk a lot about judgment, they talk about leadership, talk about integrity and character, they talk about all that stuff. And if you say, well, but how about some of those great little nuggets I used to teach you back there in finance when I've taught 6,000 of these 68,000. And they say, yeah, I sort of remember that, but you know, that was interesting, but that's not what it was all about. What it was all about was engaged in an intensive process of learning how to think. So I think when you think about the future of management education, a lot of things are clear. First of all, there's going to be a growing demand for management education all over the world. There are literally millions of future managers that have to be trained in Europe, in America, and even more importantly in the ranks of countries who have more recently joined the competitive system. And the challenge of training them is just immense. There are going to have to be all sorts of programs and all sorts of delivery vehicles, and online education has an enormously bright future. Publishing has an enormously bright future. Just about all kinds of management education have an enormously bright future. And I think the market will continue to fragment, and it'll continue to differentiate itself as people go after different slices of those literally millions of people who want to learn how to become managers. And probably within that mix, all sorts of things will claim to be an MBA, and we'll put titles MBA on things. But I think there'll be a particularly bright and relevant future for long school or university-based programs that have intense learning processes with active participation as between the faculty and the students, that study very complex problems of business practice, and whose objective is not just teaching skills and functional expertise, and not just teaching academically rigorous theories and frameworks and models, but developing, in addition to all of that, in addition to those two first axes, a third axis. It's judgment, it's leadership, it's values and attitudes. It's all of that that allows leaders to lead the organizations that they're in. I think it's absolutely necessary for professional managers to be taught all three of those things: management skills, ideas with academic rigor, and the skills of leadership and judgment. And indeed, as one looks around the globe, the need for all three of those has never been greater. And I believe that MBA programs are uniquely well positioned to deliver experiences that can capitalize on all three of those dimensions. And so both here at your school and at the Harvard Business School, we're going to continue to provide those programs, and I'm confident that their value has never been greater. Thanks for coming, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Jay. You were very successful in your lecture. So I give the floor to my colleague Antoine Yaffil. Antoine is the dean in charge of the faculty, and so as you have been very successful, I promise you, he has a kind of degree to you.
First, I'd like to reassure you, Bill Gates eventually got his degree a few months ago. But this is not the same kind of degree I'm going to give you. This is a certification that you're now a member of HEC honoris causa faculty. So this is your honoris causa degree.
Thank you very much.
visit us at www.agc.edu.